Hello and welcome. I've been thinking a lot about the upcoming announcement and the direction that Path of Exile is heading, and I want to discuss it. I think the Genesis tree going core will have very large ramifications on the game as a whole. I'm worried that the power of the Genesis tree will not shift, but it will dissipate. So let's start with the elephant in the room, which is the Genesis tree. Now, I know I have complained a lot about this in the past, and to be clear, I do not hate the Genesis tree, but I do think if it goes core, it introduces some problems. Because in the Keepers of the Flame, Genesis tree was very powerful. It drops high tier rares, 6 links, and powerful fractured bases, which meant that crafting wasn't as important. You didn't need Black Morrigan to get a 6 link. You didn't need fossil crafting to target attribute modifiers. You didn't need fracturing orbs to hit that 25% chance that you get the mod you want on a wand base. You just selected the mods you wanted out of the tree, and then boom, there's your item. So this meant that crafting diversity suffered, item progressions suffered, drop relevance suffered because you no longer had to worry about picking stuff up off the floor. You had it magically appear from a squelchy fruit, and the gear economy was all shifted because good gear was dropping out of the tree, so buying the gear you wanted wasn't as expensive. And we see this all the time with league mechanics. Typically, they'll make a league mechanic pretty strong so that it feels good to the player base because it's temporary, it's experimental, it's meant to be overtuned so that the new content feels super rewarding and people want to do it. And this happens all the time. So even if a league mechanic starts out weak, like we saw with Path of Exile 2 and the Temple, we saw with Necropolis and Path of Exile 1, they will buff it so that it is exciting for the player base. And then once it goes core, they nerf it so that it aligns with the other core mechanics in the game and isn't the one mechanic that you need to invest into. But if the tree goes core in its current state, it definitely is going to ruin the core game, in my opinion. I know that the tree is really helpful for SSF and early builds, but it really hurt the crafting economy. And at least for softcore, that's how a lot of us make progress in the game, is by selling crafting currency, and so when the value of that is diminished, it can take away from the experience, unfortunately. And I think it hid a core problem within the game, which is the ground loot. So when the tree goes core, I do anticipate it's nerfed. I anticipate that you can't drop as many links, that you can't fracture your bases. I'm expecting them to nerf the modifier tier that you can apply, so you can't drop T1 fractured bases anymore. And I think this is a necessary change to keep all the crafting at the same level. In an ideal world, crafting should be more valuable than creating an item from nothing. Creating a random item from nothing should feel worse than getting all the currency, investing into the time, gambling on each part of the craft, annulling, exalting, veiled chaos, veiled exalt, the whole shenanigan, hunter's exalted orb, whatever you gotta do, all of that should feel more rewarding than the Genesis tree. I am anticipating that they nerf that tree probably into oblivion, if I'm being honest with you. I just don't see a world in which the amount of investment you have to put into the tree right now should have that kind of result in the quality of item. The items you can get out of it are so good right now, it's just not indicative of how much work you put into it. And honestly, I also hope that they remove or nerf King's March, because those boats are too damn strong in my opinion. Why are the boats strong? Why is the tree good? Well, it's because the ground loot is bad. And what I'm trying to say is that King's March isn't the problem, Genesis tree isn't the problem is the ground loot. They're just covering up how unrewarding the base game is. And ground loot has kind of been in a bad state for a while. I saw Fubgun's video on this, I saw the calandrification of PoE from Snap on this, and both of those videos I think are very good and highlight the general like feeling within the community right now. It's very much a vibe check of where the community is as a whole. And I think we've all been feeling this to some extent. I think that's why Phrecia wasn't as fun this time around. Phrecia really exposes issues with the loot in Path of Exile because it takes every mechanic to its fullest extreme. That's why everyone loved Phrecia the first time around. You could take the power scale of any one mechanic and throw it up to 5,000, whereas the Atlas only takes it up to 500. By the time this Phrecia event came around, we'd kind of run out of weird niche strategies that we could use to generate tons of loot. The first time Phrecia was around, there were giant rogue exiles. This time around, they really nerfed a lot of the mods in the Phrecia idols that made the map feel super rewarding, which mainly was the explicit map modifier multiplier stuff. It wasn't like we saw before where you could just amp up the natural loot drops on specific enemies. The only real example I saw of this was the betrayal unique modifier mobs dropping scarabs via the all flame. But even that wasn't super rewarding unless you got specific modifiers on your T16.5 with specific petal abilities. It kind of felt like Phrecia had the magic sucked out of it from what we had seen the first time around. And the tree didn't really add anything to Phrecia either. In fact, like dropping the unique idols out of the Genesis tree was particularly heartbreaking every time you'd see it. It was just a little extra like nail in the coffin for ground loot. You know, I recently played Diablo 2 for the first time, and I was kind of shocked at how good it felt, because it made me realize that Path of Exile right now doesn't have the same satisfying loot explosions that I felt when I was playing Diablo 2. It's possible that I didn't play Diablo for long enough to really understand like what a good loot explosion was. Like maybe I played it just in the early game, and in the early game the loot explosions are all fake because they're all health potions. But I was like overwhelmed with the amount of loot that dropped in Diablo. I couldn't fit it all in my inventory, even though it seemed like items that I would want to pick up. And that was the moment for me when it really clicked. I was like, this is why people are obsessed with Diablo. This is why they tried to recreate it in Path of Exile 1, and they are also recreating it in Path of Exile 2. The loot explosion feeling was so palpable and so rewarding that of course they would want to recreate that in Path of Exile. I don't feel that right now in Path of Exile, even though it has more loot and more valuable items. Like, we do see it sometimes, but not unless you're scaling something very intense. And maybe that's why I like Delve. The Delve cities do have the loot pinatas when you open the chest that you don't really get in other parts of the game. Like, Blight can feel like that, but it doesn't feel like that unless you are deliberately scaling a mechanic. I'm just becoming more and more convinced that the actual ground loot in Path of Exile is gold, and gold you convert into wheat, and wheat you convert into divines via King's March. Like, the ground loot is no longer divines or chaos or anything like that. It is literally gold. At this point, you get more gold than doing anything else in the game. And this is a huge issue. Like, endgame strategies feel very few and far between. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of levers to pull. You're kind of relying on insanely well-rolled T17s. And I was trying to pin this back to a specific moment in time. And the turning point for me was when they overhauled scarabs and removed sextants. Now, they did this in Necropolis League, and when they did this, they like tripled the amount of scarabs. Like, the amount of scarabs that ended up in the game was ginormous. But the weird thing is, even though they scaled the amount of scarabs, it doesn't feel like the amount of farming strategies also scaled or even stayed the same. It feels like the amount of farming strategies got smaller. And as a side note, it's kind of interesting to me that they removed sextants in Path of Exile 1, but they kept them in Path of Exile 2 in the form of tablets, because tablets are essentially the same thing as sextants. But anyway, I do feel like the scarab overhaul was a complete vibe shift. Like, it was much harder to get good profit out of single league mechanics, and instead relied on someone on Reddit to like pull the slot machine lever and find the right combination of scarabs that resulted in good loot. And every time they did find that perfect slot machine roll, GGG stamped their seal of nerf on it, and then it was gone. And one by one, these strategies have been slowly diminishing until we have nothing left. And there are a couple of exceptions, like the Harvest Scarab of Cornucopia, there's the Blight Scarab of Blooming. Some of those scarabs are actually worth a little bit of money because they do properly scale the mechanic that they're supposed to scale, but those are honestly the only ones I can think of. And when they introduced these, they also introduced like so many scarabs that it's overwhelming for a normal player to find the combination of scarabs that actually produces loot in your maps. Because like, talk about the paradox of choice. The insane amount of scarabs just makes me want to throw my hands up and go delving. And you know what? That's exactly what I've been doing for the last 3 leagues. Affliction, I think, is the last league I actually tried to get ground loot with the stupid abyss strategy, because that was the high point of loot. Like, I don't think we'll ever get back to where Affliction was in terms of the ability to get money out of it, but after that, I kind of felt like there was no point in trying to farm for map loot, because every time I tried to scale it, it didn't feel like the amount of effort I was putting in was getting rewarded in any way. And after Affliction, I think the pendulum just swung so hard in the other direction, because now like I can count the hyper profitable strategies on one hand, and nearly all of those strategies are like guaranteed by a mechanic. So like strong boxes or delirium are guaranteed because delirium has the little like currency meter that fills up and then it drops currency, right? It's not like you go into a tier 16 map and you see what drops and you get good loot. You probably get the same loot between a tier 1 map and a tier 16 map. Welcome to the dark editing room, where I have to tell you that I actually did test this. So the footage you are about to see, one of them is a tier 1 map and one of them is a tier 16 map, both with the same amount of quant, because I wanted to get the equivalence here. And let me tell you, the tier 16 did not perform much better. I think we got 1 extra chaos, but this is the footage you're about to see is both a tier 1 and a tier 16, and they are the same. And this is a huge problem, because ideally a tier 1 map and a tier 16 map should have drastically different drops. You should get way more out of a tier 16 map than you do out of a tier 1 map. And this is something that I think Path of Exile 2 does a better job at. Like, I feel like Path of Exile 2 has captured that Diablo 2 feeling much better than Path of Exile 1, in my opinion, because in Path of Exile 2, the difficult monsters really do feel like they'll drop something. Like a big rare could give you a chaos, it gives a couple exalt, but the first game has completely lost that. Path of Exile 1 did used to have this. You used to be able to farm infinite rares for infinite money. Like, the whole strategy is to fit more rares in one map. But now we're fighting for our lives with some niche blight strategy that drops fancy maps, and that's the best thing we had to make money. And so the problem that it creates for new players is that it means that if you are just progressing through the Atlas, if you're leveling, you don't really pick up valuable stuff unless you're pairing it with some specific league strategy and league currency that you can sell. The rares in Path of Exile 1 like don't feel rewarding anymore, and honestly are just annoying with volatile cores and soul eater stacks. I'm kind of over it. Because if you're new to the game, you're wondering to yourself, when do I start dropping the good items? And unfortunately in Path of Exile right now, the answer is you don't. I remember my very first character that I got to mapping, and my friends gifted me a 4 divine Chevron's wrappings, and I was over the moon, and I thought, man, now I'm gonna start dropping insane money and maybe I could catch up to them and get more defines and make money like they're making money. And I'm doing like tier 6 maps and I'm like, okay, hey friends, when do I start finding good items? And they were like, tier 9 maybe? Like that's when the items might start to be somewhat useful. And this was nearly 4 years ago, but I bet if I asked them that question today, they would have a very different answer. I bet that they would say, you're not gonna get good loot unless you do heist, unless you spec into blight, unless you find some other mechanic that drops good items, because I kind of doubt that anyone right now really feels like there's a tier of maps where once you reach it, you start dropping good items. It really feels like no matter which tier of map you're doing, you kind of have the same chance to drop whatever you can if you're not juicing it up with something. Because if you watch Fubgun's video, he's running a juice tier 16 map, just looking at ground loot. He drops pretty much nothing. Like, not even an orb of fusing, not a glass blowers, I don't even know if he dropped a chaos, to be honest with you. He drops pretty much nothing, and that's exactly what I would expect to see in a tier 3 map. But a tier 16, that should be dropping much better loot. So for people coming over from Path of Exile 2 to Path of Exile 1, they're working their way through the Atlas, they're trying to figure out how to make money. Well, it turns out that just improving your character and doing harder content is not the way to make money. You do have to incorporate some sort of league mechanic that you juice up. And this is something that I don't really agree with. I think that we should be able to have our maps inherently drop items. I think that you shouldn't have to rely on these very niche strategies to make any money. With all this frustration, they have said that they're working on this. So there was a what we're working on for Keepers of the Flame where they said that they are working on endgame strategy diversity. And they specifically mentioned this for 328, which is something they don't normally do. So this tells me that there probably is some big overhaul coming for 328. And I'm excited about it. I think one other indicator we have is that the game designer Octavian is going to be part of the Q&A for the upcoming reveal. If you don't know who Octavian is, by the way, don't worry, because I don't really know either. He used to be a beloved streamer before GGG scooped him up and hired him, and he had a large hand in the development of tier 17s, even though he acknowledges now that there are issues with tier 17s, and he's super well liked in the community. Basically every sentiment I found of Octavian was super positive. He's very good at explaining things. He's made a lot of really good build guides, and people are pretty excited to have him in the Q&A, and I must say I am as well, because I'm hopeful that this will give us something more than just the surface level design philosophy interview. I'm hopeful that we're going to get into some nitty-gritty, that they can explain loot balance, how endgame juicing mechanically will work. I'm hoping for some discussions about how they're handling drop progression, whether the multiplicative systems are coming back, how they plan to restore strategy diversity, and what role ground loot is supposed to play going forward as compared to tile loot, which is what would drop from a guaranteed league mechanic like the Delirium rewards, which fill up the meter. So this is the conversation I want. I want each mechanic to feel like it can be stretched to insane difficulty with insane loot explosions. I want the higher monster level to result in better items. I want tier 16s to feel like they're actually dropping rare and difficult rewards. And I am hopeful and optimistic because they know this is a problem. They're aware of how unfun tier 17 map modifiers are right now. They've acknowledged that the current scarab modifiers don't result in a diversity of strategies. So I'm hopeful that 328 will bring a new iteration of endgame rebalancing to Path of Exile. I'm even more hopeful that this time it will be in an upward direction, providing us more loot than before, where it just slashed out the top end strategy for people. And maybe this is copium, hopium, whatever your drug of choice is, but I will see you after the reveal and we can decide whether they've lived up to these expectations or if we will just be doing blight farming for the rest of the league. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your morning, day, evening, whatever it is. I will see you in the next one. Bye!